Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the SERMAPod. This is the podcast for the Sports and Entertainment Risk Management Alliance. I am your host, also the founder and CEO of SERMA, Rich Lenkov, and we are very pleased to have with us a very special guest, Shirin Malkani from Perkins, Coie. Shirin is the co-chair of the sports group at the law firm and an expert in emerging media and technology when it comes to sports. Shirin, welcome to the SERMAPod.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, of course, technology has always been a big part of sports and entertainment. You could think of a lot of innovations when it comes to things like instant replay and drones and a lot of the camera technology. NFL Films has really moved the needle when it comes to covering sports for years and years. But artificial intelligence has taken this to a whole new level. Explain to us how the game, so to speak, has changed with AI in covering sports.
Yeah, I think there's so many different vectors where you can talk about how AI is impacting sports. I think there's the broadcast piece. You alluded to it to some degree with drones and just the number of cameras placed on a field now, but we're also looking at alternative casts like the Super Bowl this year with live from Bikini Bottom, SpongeBob integrations. Thursday Night Football, right, on Amazon has a ton of added content that is AI generated. Even betting, right? Personalized recommendations around prop betting are now available on a variety of platforms. Content localization now is so much more seamless and cost effective using generative AI. So which I think kind of democratizes content in a way that's, I think, great for all sports fans because we have streaming platforms like YouTube, but we didn't always have well-produced content for all of the events that we might want to watch. So that's just broadcast, right? We can talk about highlights and advanced stats, how AI is impacting that, and frankly has been for years. I spent many years at the NBA, and we were using a company called WSC over 10 years ago to do personalized highlight packages for fans. And then there's a ton of stuff going on the field itself in terms of player training and safety, studying opponents, recruiting, officiating. And then there's operations themselves, right? In venue, how do we move crowds? How do we do with parking and traffic, concessions, safety and security? So I think there are just so many ways that AI is impacting sports, and there are a lot of things to unpack there. So happy to delve into any of them in more detail.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And of course, all of these emerging issues come with them a host of legal issues, which we want to focus on today in some respect. But first of all, I think we came to some of this information because of the excellent Bloomberg Law article that you authored dealing with some copyright issues, contract issues at the Super Bowl involving AI. Can you explain what those issues were?
Sure. On the copyright side, I think some of this is fairly well understood, or not well understood because a lot of it is unsettled, but something that people have been talking about for at least a year or so. So there's issues about training data, right? Which in a sports context may be less of an issue because if you're using AI for player safety, for example, you're going to be training it on your own players' data. Now there may be issues under a collective bargaining agreement, but by and large, if the players are giving you consent to use that data, that's an easier question when it comes to potential fair use. Also, that data may not be copyrighted to begin with. But when you're thinking about copyright issues more broadly, there's also a question of maybe who owns the copyright. Again, if we're talking about player data, it's less of an issue. It could potentially be more of an issue in broadcast. I don't think anyone is going to question that the NFL owns the rights to the Bikini Bottom Super Bowl, but obviously there's third-party IP integrated in there, but under a licensing relationship, so probably okay. Where you may get into some issues in terms of contractual use of generative AI is the technologies themselves. Sometimes the tool providers put specific protections either around the tools or the output. Again, in sports, a lot of this is going to be bespoke. So hopefully you have direct contracting relationships with the tool providers. But if you're an average person using generative AI in a sports context to produce some sort of content, you may find that there are ownership issues around either the inputs or the outputs. And of course, privacy and rights of publicity come in place if anything that you are using in terms of the content is real people that then are being sort of put through the generative AI process. Again, in the sports context, you should have the rights you need not only from the players, but the coaches, fans. Typically Ticketback will have the necessary license if you're getting images of fans that might ultimately be used in AI. So those are some of the more common issues that, because we're dealing with it in a sports context with very sophisticated players, hopefully you've got contracts in place to address that. The one place that's, I think, more of a gray area can be with some of the player data. So not necessarily the players on the field when 36 cameras are capturing all of their movements and that's being fed into algorithms for the benefit of a team or a league. But individual athletes often use, their own devices, whether it's Whoop or something associated with an Apple Health device. And they may be unaware that they're giving their data to larger aggregated pools of data separate from how they use it in a training context.
So you mentioned player contracts, and hopefully these are licensing contracts. Is it common for the standard NFLPA contract right now to include these licenses, or is it really, as you mentioned earlier, bespoke to each individual player? What's the standard contract these days say?
Yeah, I think the collective bargaining agreements are going to vary a little bit from league to league, but by and large, there's going to be some provisions in there that will provide for use, particularly if it's around player safety and training. That's something that the players themselves benefit from. There are obviously going to be limits when you're talking about taking like biometric or health data and commercializing it. So, lots of people would maybe love to know how fast a particular player gets back on defense. And some of that positional information is used by teams for coaching decisions, but they're not necessarily commercialized. And so I think that's where in the collective bargaining agreements, you'll often see a pretty strong dividing line for what teams and leagues can and can't do with that data. But to answer your question, it is pretty standardized under the collective bargaining agreement. So players should know once they've signed a standard agreement in a major U.S. league or like Foreign Soccer Federation, where their data is going and how it's being used.
Now, what kind of decisions are being made at the broadcast or network level today that are different than even a few years ago when it comes to using AI?
I mean, I think a lot of it is now that there's so much more power. I mean, people have thought about stats in the context of covering sports as long as people have covered sports, right? There are box scores going back to newspaper days. But because of the computing power, I think what broadcasters are considering is, what do you want to add to a broadcast? What sort of additional features might you want to overlay that would genuinely improve the fan experience and not take away from it? I think a lot of the things that Amazon's been doing on Thursday Night Football with data insights, I think they have like defensive alerts. Is there likely to be a blitz? Prime targets for a quarterback throwing a pass, fourth down territory, what would be the best decision to make there? Those are places where I think if you're a broadcaster, you're thinking, okay, I have access to all this information. What can I do with it to actually enhance the broadcast and not take away from the viewing experience?
And the fact that, as you mentioned, fans are now empowered more than ever to control the type of content they consume, that makes this technology all that more exciting, but also that much more problematic potentially legally, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that the leagues have always been very protective about how games are distributed in the broadcast. And certainly every agreement I've ever seen, there's always language, slightly different versions depending on what league or federation you're talking about, but they all want approval over anything that is squeezing back the display or overlaying the display of their games on a broadcast. So while there's a certain amount of personalization that can be put in the hands of viewers and fans, there's still a lot of approval rights that come from the league. Even something like multi-view, like you'll see in Sunday Ticket on YouTube, that's something that leagues have to sign off on. They have to be okay with that. And so in some ways, there's not tension, but there are different constituencies who are representing the fan there. There are the platforms and the broadcasters, and then there are the leagues, and they're both trying to navigate it in a way that produces the best kind of product for the fan experience.
Shirin, what about gambling? You mentioned, obviously, that's a huge area of growth for every major sport. How has AI produce some legal challenges involving wagering and gaming.
Yeah, I mean, look, the legal challenges are sort of well known when it comes to the betting ecosystem, where things are legal, where aren't they legal, how online can be done versus in person. I think what's interesting here is how platforms that may or may not have rights to separately stream games are thinking about how to have their platforms interact more directly with what's going on the second screen where a game is actually being broadcast. So, a lot of platforms are taking information from their bettors' personal accounts on platform and using that to surface, say, like real-time prop betting. And of course, that real-time prop betting has its own challenges, as we've seen in a variety of leagues, where those are often the most easily manipulable. I think what people will say is the good thing about legalizing betting is you've now actually have all these AI-based algorithms looking at betting across platforms and around different players or games and can ferret out when there may be something illegal going on.
How do you see this affecting the NCAA, the amateur so-called level, although we know from the settlement last week that the NCAA has agreed to let schools now pay student athletes? How do you think this will affect that level of sports?
I mean, I think it's going to affect it the same way it has professional sports, right? I mean, there's always going to be this divide around what the players can and can't bet on, right? Not only can they not bet on themselves and their teammates, they can't bet on their sports. That's obviously true today and will continue to be true at the amateur level. But I think, again, by bringing things more above board, you often have a better opportunity through AI and advanced machine learning and algorithms to police this more. But I'm not sure that ultimately what's happening in the NCAA ends up playing out all that differently than what we've seen in the last 5 to 7 years in the U.S. on the professional side.
Sure, and also some of this technology being used for security, right, in exiting and entering venues, facial recognition technology. There's some legal implications specifically regarding privacy there. Could you expand on that a little, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, we understand ticket back language when we go into a venue about sort of the rules. It's private property, and therefore, there are things that the owners of those venues are permitted to do. But when you talk about facial recognition or body scanning sensors plus AI, whether they're detecting weapons, ensuring you are on a clear list, a lot of the venues integrate Clear for a security point of view. And so I think there's a lot of questions, particularly as venues are being upgraded around this technology, is that disclosure piece. How do you let fans know and make sure that they're comfortable before they enter the venue with things like facial recognition software? And most folks, because it is for safety and security, and sometimes to speed up concession sales, there are certain venues that use facial recognition for ID purposes. So you can buy beer from a kiosk, for example, where most fans are very happy to kind of trade that potential, I won't say breach of privacy, but giving up a certain amount of privacy and personal data in order to have a better, more seamless experience in venue. But the venues themselves want to be really careful about how they are disclosing those issues and getting the necessary consent. And we're seeing a lot more folks kind of dig into that. And because privacy these days is often very state by state, you may have a different solution in California than you would in Colorado.
Shirin Malkani from Perkins Coie, thank you so much for joining us on the SERMAPod. Please come back and update us on this very interesting issue.
Thanks again for having me.